The moment Helen Bancroft pushed open the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon in Dust Creek, Texas, on a sweltering afternoon in the summer of 1878, every man in the room stopped breathing for just a beat too long. She was not what they expected. That was perhaps the first thing worth noting about her. She stood 5'4" in worn leather boots that had walked too many miles, her dark brown hair pinned back with a practical twist that was slowly losing the fight against the heat. Her dress was clean but faded, the pale blue of it gone almost to the color of morning clouds after too many washings. There were calluses on her hands that told a story of hard work, and there was a set to her jaw that told a different story altogether, one about a woman who had made up her mind to do something difficult and was going to do it whether the world cooperated or not. What she carried under her arm, wrapped in an oilskin cloth, was the real reason she had come. The Silver Spur was not the finest establishment in West Texas. The floorboards had warped in the summer heat so that they created soft hills and valleys underfoot. The bar was a long plank of pine that had been polished by years of elbows and spilled whiskey to a dark amber shine. The mirror behind the bar had a crack running through the upper left corner, which meant every man who looked at his own reflection saw himself slightly fractured. The piano in the corner was currently being played with more enthusiasm than talent by a young man named Curtis who had been drinking since noon. There were maybe 12 men in the room, which was a modest crowd for a Saturday afternoon, but the kind of crowd that notices a woman when she walks in alone. Helen Bancroft did not waver. She walked straight to the bar, set the oilskin bundle on the counter with a sound that was a little heavier than expected, and said to the barman, whose name she did not yet know, "I am looking to sell a gun. Someone told me this is the place where things get bought and sold." The barman, a wide man named Gus with a mustache that had opinions of its own, looked at the bundle and then looked at her and then said, "Well now." That was not an answer, but it was something. The room had not gone back to its regular noise. A few conversations resumed at a lower volume, the way conversations do when people want to keep listening while pretending they are not. The piano continued its slightly off-key rendering of something that might have been a waltz in a previous life. Helen unwrapped the oilskin cloth with careful hands. What came out of it was a Colt single-action army revolver, the model they had been calling the Peacemaker since it started coming out of the Hartford factory just a few years earlier, in 1873. This particular one had a 7.5-inch barrel, the kind made for cavalry officers and men who spent long hours on horseback. The grip was walnut, smooth from years of handling. The finish had worn away in places, revealing the steel beneath, but the mechanism was clean and well-maintained, and anyone who knew anything about firearms would have been able to see at a glance that this was a gun that had been cared for. "My father's," Helen said, though no one had asked. She said it quietly, the way you say something you have been saying inside your own head for a long time before you find the courage to say it out loud. "He passed 3 weeks ago. I need the money for the land deed. The bank has given me until the 15th. Gus looked at the gun. He looked at the woman. He scratched the side of his jaw with one finger. "I don't personally deal in firearms, ma'am." "Now Hendricks over at the dry goods might, or you could try. How much?" The voice that asked that question came from the far end of the bar, and it was the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be heard over everything else in the room. It was a low voice, steady and deliberate, with no particular accent except the flat, unhurried quality of a man who had spent many years in open country. It was the voice of a man who did not speak unless he had something to say. Helen turned her head. The man at the far end of the bar was leaning with his back against the counter, facing the room, holding a glass of whiskey that he had not touched in some time, judging by the way the ice. There was no ice. It was 1878 in West Texas, judging by the way the glass sat still in his hand without a ring of condensation beneath it. He was tall, or would have been if he were standing straight rather than leaning in that particular way that made him look like the bar was the only thing keeping him attached to the earth. He had dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, and a face that had been shaped by weather and years into something that was not quite handsome and not quite hard, but somewhere in between. The kind of face that belonged to a painting of the frontier, rather than to a man you expected to meet in real life. He wore a plain dark coat over a gray shirt, and there was a gun on his hip that sat there with the casual familiarity of something that had been there a very long time. He was looking at her. Not in the way most of the other men in the room had been looking at her, which was with varying degrees of appreciation or calculation. He was looking at her the way you look at something that has surprised you, and he was the kind of man who did not often get surprised. "Ira Hadley," Gus said, in a tone that was equal parts warning and explanation, and he said it to Helen in a low voice, as if she would know what to do with the name. She did know what to do with it. Everyone in Dust Creek knew the name, and most of the territory besides. Ira Hadley was, depending on who you asked, one of the following things: the most successful cattle broker in 3 counties, a former lawman of some disputed history, a man who had killed 3 men in fair fights and had the papers to prove it, or the hardest man in any room he walked into. People did not always agree on which of those descriptions was the most important, but they tended to agree that all of them were true. Helen Bancroft looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the gun on the counter. "I don't know what it's worth," she said, not directing this at anyone in particular. "I just know I need $40 by the 15th. The room was very quiet. $40 was not nothing. It was also not an impossible sum, but it was the kind of sum that had weight to it, the kind that told you something had gone seriously wrong in someone's life for them to be standing in a saloon trying to sell their dead father's gun to strangers. Ira Hadley pushed off from the bar and walked toward her. The room made way for him the way water makes way for a stone dropped into it, not dramatically, just naturally, as a consequence of what he was. He stopped at a polite distance and looked down at the gun, and then something happened to his face that was very subtle and that Helen, watching him, almost missed. His jaw tightened, very slightly, and then released. His eyes stayed on the gun for a moment longer than necessary. "May I?" he asked. He indicated the gun with one hand. Helen looked at him for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than comfort allowed. Then she said, "Yes." He picked it up with the ease of long familiarity, checked the cylinder the way someone does when they are not checking whether it is loaded so much as when they are checking something else entirely, something about the mechanism, the wear, the particular history of the thing. He turned it over. He looked at the grip. He looked at a small mark on the barrel that might have been a repair or might have been a customization, hard to say. He held it for a moment longer than the examination required, and then he set it down on the counter. "This is James Bancroft's gun," he said. Helen's breath caught. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. "You knew him." It was not quite a question. Ira looked at her, and for the first time there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before, something that was not quite grief but was in the neighborhood of it. "I did," he said. "A long time ago." The piano had stopped. Curtis had apparently decided this was a good moment to pour himself another drink rather than continue with the waltz. "He never mentioned you," Helen said. She was not sure why she said it except that it felt like something she needed to establish, something about what she knew and what she did not know. "No," Ira said, in a tone that suggested this was not surprising to him. He wouldn't have. There was a history in that sentence that Helen could not read, and she did not have the luxury of time to try to parse it. She straightened her shoulders and said, "So, what will you give me for it?" Ira looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I won't buy it." She felt the floor shift under her, which was partly the warped boards and partly the word no arriving in a place she had been counting on yes. She kept her face very still. "I see." "But," he said, and the word landed differently, with weight and intention, "I have a proposition for you, an offer you may find more useful than $40. Helen looked at him with the measured caution of a woman who has grown up in a part of the world where men making offers to women alone in saloons were rarely offering something straightforward. "I am listening," she said, and her tone made it clear she was listening critically. Ira Hadley set his untouched glass on the bar and turned to face her fully. He was a man who moved with economy, without waste or flourish, which made this gesture of giving her his full attention feel deliberate and significant. "I know about the Bancroft land deed," he said. 240 acres on the North Fork of the Sable Creek. "I know about the bank note that comes due on the 15th, and I know that $40 won't satisfy it." Helen went very still. "How do you know that?" "Because I was the one who spoke to Harlan Webb at the bank 3 days ago about extending the note," Ira said, "and he told me it was already being called in, and he mentioned the name Bancroft, and I recognized it." The implications of this landed on Helen in stages. Someone had already tried to extend the note. Someone she did not know, had not asked, had not been aware of. She was not entirely sure how she felt about that. There was gratitude somewhere in the mix, but there was also a complicated tangle of pride and wariness that made her set her jaw in the way she had. "Mr. Hadley," she said, "I don't know what business it was of yours." "It wasn't," he agreed. He was completely undefensive about it, which was somehow more disarming than if he had made excuses. "It was none of my business. But your father once did me a service that I never repaid, and he is dead now, and you are standing in a saloon trying to sell his most prized possession to cover a debt that should not exist. So here is my offer." He paused. Not for drama, but in the way someone pauses when they are selecting their words with precision. "I need a manager for my South pasture land. I have 1,700 acres that I have been running cattle on for 6 years, and the man who managed it for me, a fellow named Grady, broke his leg 2 months ago and cannot work for the rest of the season. I need someone who knows land, who knows horses, who can communicate with my ranch hands and manage the books and make decisions when I am away on business. Your father ran his 240 acres for 20 years, and he ran it well. I have every reason to think his daughter knows how to manage land." The room had definitely gone quieter. Gus had found something to polish at the far end of the bar. A few of the other men had developed sudden interests in their drinks. "I will pay you $50 a month," Ira continued, "with room and board included at the ranch house. At the end of the first month, you will have enough to satisfy the bank note and then some. And I will personally speak to Harlan Webb about extending the deadline by 2 weeks to give us time to arrange the terms." Helen looked at him. She was doing calculations, and she was also doing assessments of a different kind, the kind where you try to read whether a man is offering something genuine or something else. "What happens to the gun?" she asked. It was a strange question, perhaps, given everything else he had said. But it felt like the most important one. "You keep it," Ira said. "That gun is not for sale, not to me, not to anyone." Something in Helen's chest shifted. It was a small movement, barely a feeling at all, but it was there. She looked at the gun and then back at him. "You said my father did you a service." "He did." "What service?" Ira was quiet for a moment. "He pulled me out of a creek in the winter of 1866, when I was 22 years old and foolish enough to try crossing the Sable in full flood. Would have drowned. He got his horse in the water and pulled me out and let me sleep in his barn for 3 days while I recovered. Never asked anything for it." Helen was 24 years old. She had not been born yet in 1866. Her father had never told her that story. She felt, suddenly and unexpectedly, a wave of something that was not quite sadness but was in the same family, a grief that had new dimensions to it she had not previously been aware of. Her father had saved the life of this man, who was now standing in front of her 12 years later offering to save something of hers. The symmetry of it was almost too much. She picked up her father's gun and wrapped it carefully back in the oilskin cloth. 2 weeks, she said. "You said you would get me 2 weeks. I can have the papers to Webb by tomorrow morning." She held the wrapped gun against her chest for a moment, the way you hold something precious. Then she looked at Ira Hadley and said, "When do I start?" He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on his face, and it was more in the eyes than the mouth, a slight softening, a small warming. "Monday," he said, "if that suits you." "Monday suits me," Helen said. She turned and walked back toward the doors of the saloon, and the doors swung behind her, and the room exhaled as one and then immediately broke into a noise level considerably higher than it had been before she arrived, everyone having opinions they had been containing. Ira Hadley picked up his glass and drank the whiskey. Helen Bancroft stood outside the saloon in the late afternoon sun and breathed for a moment. Then she looked down at the oilskin bundle in her arms and she said, very quietly, "All right, Papa. Let's see where this goes." She had not cried since her father died. She was not going to cry now. But her eyes were bright when she started walking back toward the boarding house where she had been staying, and the sun was warm on her face, and somewhere inside the complicated tangle of grief and fear and calculation, there was something small and new that she could not quite name yet. She would start Monday. That was a beginning. The road from Dust Creek to the Hadley Ranch was about 4 miles of flat and nearly flat land that rose eventually into the gentle rolling hills of the North Fork country. Helen made the drive on Monday morning in her father's old wagon, the same wagon she had been using for the last 3 weeks to manage what remained of his affairs. The horse that pulled it was a roan mare named Bessie, who was gentle and reliable and 12 years old, and who had opinions about going uphill that she expressed through her ears. The oilskin bundle sat on the seat beside Helen because there had not seemed to be anywhere else appropriate to put it. She had spent the weekend in a state of very productive agitation. She had gone to the land deed office on Saturday afternoon and confirmed with her own eyes that the bank note existed and that the deadline was real. She had gone back to the boarding house and written out a list of every skill she possessed and assessed them honestly, which was something her father had taught her to do. The list was respectable. She could read and write and do arithmetic. She had managed the books for her father's ranch for the last 3 years. She knew cattle, she knew horses, she knew how to speak to ranch hands in a way that was clear and fair. She had been born on a ranch and had worked one all her life. What she did not know was Ira Hadley, and that was the uncertainty that had kept her company through most of Saturday night. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road on Monday morning like something out of a painting, the kind of painting that a person makes when they want to communicate abundance without ostentation. The main house was a long, low structure of pale limestone with a wide porch running along the front, the kind of porch that was built with afternoon shade in mind. Behind it were several outbuildings, including a large barn painted red in the way that barns were painted red out of long tradition, a bunkhouse that was clearly in regular use, a separate smaller structure that might have been a smokehouse, and beyond all of it, the open rolling land with cattle visible in the middle distance. There were 3 men in the yard when Helen arrived. One of them was Ira Hadley. He was wearing work clothes rather than the dark coat from the saloon, a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and canvas trousers and boots that had seen mud in them. He looked different in working clothes, younger somehow, or perhaps just more present, more solid. He was talking to 2 other men when she pulled the wagon in, and he finished what he was saying to them before he turned to acknowledge her, which she noted as a point in his favor. He did not drop everything the moment a woman arrived. He finished his thought. "Miss Bancroft," he said. He came to the wagon and offered his hand to help her down, which she took. "Mr. Hadley," she said. He introduced her to the 2 ranch hands. One was a man named Samuel Torres, who was perhaps 40 years old, with a broad, capable face, and the kind of quiet authority that develops in men who have been doing the same honest work for many years. The other was younger, perhaps 19 or 20, a boy called Eli who had freckles and an eager quality that reminded Helen of a young dog. There were 4 other hands on the property, Ira explained, currently out on the pasture. "I'll show you the house and the books," Ira said. "Then Samuel can take you around the land." The inside of the house was spare and functional, which was not the same thing as empty or cold. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, and a table large enough for several people and a few chairs that had been broken and repaired with such thoroughness that the repairs were better than the originals. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and there was a bedroom at each end of the main room. Ira showed her the room she would use, which was at the east end and had a window that looked out over the land toward where the cattle were. The bed had clean sheets on it, and there was a hook on the wall for hanging things. There was a small writing desk in the corner. "The books are in here," Ira said, opening a door off the main room that led into what served as an office. There was a large desk and shelves of ledgers, and a map of the property pinned to the wall. "Grady kept the records, but he's been gone 2 months and I have been keeping them myself, and I am," he said this with a directness that surprised her, "not naturally suited to accounting. I expect you will find things in better shape than they might appear." Helen looked at the ledgers and her fingers itched to open them. "I will review these today." "Good," he said. They stood in the office for a moment in the particular kind of silence that exists between two people who have just entered into an arrangement and are both taking the measure of what they have committed to. "Your father's gun is in your room," Ira said. "I noticed you left it on the wagon seat." "I thought it would be better inside." Helen looked at him. He had moved her father's gun without being asked, not because he had overstepped, but because he had seen a thing that needed doing and done it. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of small thing that tells you something true about a person. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left her to it. The first 2 weeks at the Hadley ranch were a revelation in several specific ways, not all of them expected. The first revelation was the land itself. 240 acres was what Helen had grown up on, and she had believed it to be a substantial piece of ground. 1,700 acres was something else entirely. Riding it with Samuel Torres on that first Monday afternoon, moving through the north and south pastures, past the creek that ran clear and cold even in August, up the gentle rise to the eastern fence line where the cattle grazed in considerable numbers, Helen felt something that she had not expected to feel, which was a kind of awe. The land was beautiful. West Texas was not always beautiful. It could be brutal and blank and unforgiving. But this particular piece of it, in this particular afternoon light, with the grass gold and the sky enormous above it, was as beautiful as anything she had ever seen. "Good land," she said to Samuel, who was riding beside her on a bay horse. "Very good land," he agreed in a tone that contained years of appreciation in it. "Mr. Hadley has worked it carefully. He does not overgraze. He rotates the cattle. He spent 3 years putting in the fence lines correctly." "You have been here a long time," Helen observed. 8 years, Samuel said. "I came up from San Antonio. Mr. Hadley found me working a bad job for a bad employer, and he offered me fair pay and fair treatment." He paused, "which he has always provided." Helen filed this information away. It told her things. The second revelation was Ira Hadley's absence. He left on Thursday of that first week for a cattle sale in Abilene, which was a journey of several days, and he left the ranch in her hands with a directness that was either very trusting or very testing, and she was not entirely sure which. He had reviewed the books with her for 2 evenings before he left, going through the numbers with her line by line, and she had identified 3 areas where Grady's record-keeping had been inconsistent and 2 places where costs could be reduced without affecting the operation. And Ira had listened to all of it without interrupting, and then said, "Yes, that's right. And I had wondered about the feed costs myself," in a way that indicated he had known these things but wanted to see if she would find them. That was definitely testing rather than trusting, but she did not mind it. She would have done the same. She managed the ranch in his absence competently and without drama. She negotiated with a supplier from Dust Creek who came by on Friday to quote a price for winter hay that was 20% higher than the previous year's price, and she sent him away with a counteroffer and a clear statement of what she was willing to pay. And he came back the next day and agreed to her number with the expressions of a man who had expected easier negotiations. Samuel Torres watched this exchange from a respectful distance and later told young Eli that Miss Bancroft knew exactly what she was doing, which Eli immediately and obviously believed, because he had already decided she was wonderful. Ira returned on the following Tuesday morning with a successful sale completed and 2 contracts for the fall cattle drive signed. He found Helen at the desk in the office with the books open and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and a list of items requiring his attention set to one side in neat handwriting. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. She was frowning at a column of figures in the way you frown at something that is almost right but not quite, and the frown was not unpleasant. It was focused, and she had a strand of hair that had escaped its pin and was lying against her cheek, and there was a small ink stain on her left hand from the pen. He had been thinking about her while he was in Abilene, not in a way he had planned or encouraged. She had appeared in his thinking somewhat uninvited, the way a question does when you have not resolved it. He had told himself this was because the arrangement was unusual, because she was the daughter of a man he had known, because there was history here that needed managing. These were all reasonable explanations, and he believed approximately half of them. The hay supplier came, Helen said, without looking up. She had sensed him in the doorway. I settled it at last year's price. He tried to raise it, but I didn't let him. I can see that, Ira said, coming in and picking up the list. He looked at it. You renegotiated the farrier contract too. He was charging you for 12 horses when you only have 9 in regular work. The other 3 are in light rotation. Ira sat down in the chair across from the desk. He looked at the list and then he looked at her. You've done good work, he said. Helen put down her pen and looked at him. How was Abilene? Hot and loud and full of men trying to negotiate in bad faith, he said. I sold 80 head at a price I was satisfied with. I see the contract numbers in the book from last year, she said. The price per head is up from 1877. 8% up, he agreed. It was a better market. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence that had been developing between them over the past 2 weeks, the kind of silence that exists between 2 people who are finding, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they are compatible, not just in work, though that was clearly true, in something more fundamental, some basic frequency at which they both seemed to operate. I need to ride the east fence line tomorrow, Helen said. Samuel thinks there may be a section that needs repair before the fall. I'd like to see it myself. I'll ride with you, Ira said. She looked at him. I can manage it myself. I know you can, he said. I'd like to see it too. She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, all right, and went back to her ledger. The fence line ride the next morning was when something shifted between them that neither of them had entirely prepared for. It was a clear morning with just enough wind to make the heat bearable, and they rode out together on the 2 best horses from the barn. Helen on a steady chestnut that Samuel had recommended, and Ira on a dark bay that was clearly his regular mount and knew it. They rode mostly in comfortable conversation, talking about the ranch and the cattle and the fall plans, and Helen asked questions that were intelligent and specific, and Ira answered them fully rather than partially, which was something he had not always done with people in professional contexts. They found the damaged section of fence about 2 miles out, where a large branch from a cottonwood tree had come down in a recent storm and taken out a 20-foot section of the line. The cattle in the east pasture had not found it yet, which was fortunate, but it needed immediate attention. They dismounted and walked the damage together, assessing what was needed. Helen touched the broken posts with practiced hands, testing which ones could be salvaged and which needed replacement, and Ira watched her do this and felt something that he later spent considerable time not describing to himself. 4 posts and about 30 feet of wire, Helen said. Samuel's boys can have this done by tomorrow afternoon if we bring the materials today. Agreed, Ira said. They stood together beside the fence in the warm morning, and without any particular plan, They were standing very close. Not improperly close, just the close that happens when two people have been working side by side and the task has put them in proximity, and neither of them has thought to step back. Ira looked at her profile, the straight nose, the set of her jaw that he was learning to read, which meant she was thinking carefully about something. The way she stood with a self-possession that was not defiant, just settled, as if she had made her peace with occupying space. "You are not afraid of the work," he said. She turned to look at him, mildly surprised by the observation. "Why would I be? Most people I hire to manage things want to manage from a desk," he said. "They don't want to ride fence lines. They think the oversight is beneath them." "My father taught me that if you want to know what's happening, you go look at it," Helen said. "You don't read about it in a ledger." "Well," she added with a small dry quality that was the closest she came to humor in those early days, "you read the ledger too, but then you go look." He was smiling again, the eyes more than the mouth smile that she had started cataloging without quite meaning to. "Your father was a wise man," he said. "He was," Helen said. The word was quiet and present and without the wall around it that grief sometimes builds. "Tell me about him," Ira said. She was quiet for a moment. The horse behind her shifted its weight and breathed. The wind moved through the cottonwood above them, the surviving part of it, the part still standing. "He was a methodical man," Helen said. "He wrote everything down. He kept records of every rainfall, every calf born, every repair made to every building. He believed that if you paid attention carefully enough, the land would tell you what it needed." She paused. "He was not a man who talked about feelings, but he was present. When he was with you, he was entirely with you." She looked at the broken fence rather than at Ira. "He taught me everything I know about this kind of work. When my mother died, I was 11 and there was no one else to help run the place, so he just taught me. He never seemed to think it was unusual." "It wasn't unusual," Ira said. "It was sensible." She looked at him then, and there was something in her expression that was gratitude, but also something more than gratitude, a recognition that he had said the right thing in the right way and that this was not a small thing. "How did he die?" Ira asked. He asked it gently, but he asked it directly, which was the way he asked everything. "Heart," Helen said. "He was 58 years old and healthy in every way that a doctor could measure, and then one morning in July he was gone. It was quick, which is a mercy, I suppose, but it was entirely without warning, which is its own kind of cruelty." "I'm sorry," Ira said. He said it simply, without elaboration or softening, and for that reason it landed more truly than if he had said more. They rode back to the ranch together, in a conversation that had found new depth, ranging from her father to his, from the history of the land to the history of the territory, from the Indian campaigns that had scarred the landscape and its people in ways that were still raw, the forced removal of the Comanche from the Llano Estacado just years before, still sitting heavy on the conscience of anyone willing to look at what had been done to the people who had lived there for generations before any of them arrived, to the more immediate and daily business of cattle prices and water rights. Helen found that she had things to say and that he listened to her say them. Not with the patience of a man waiting for a woman to finish talking, with the engagement of a person who was genuinely interested in what she thought. By the time they returned to the ranch yard, something had changed between them that was hard to name precisely, but that Samuel Torres noted from a distance and catalogued without comment. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Helen found herself settling into with a comfort that surprised her. She rose early, managed the morning work, spent hours in the books, rode the land regularly, dealt with suppliers and vendors and occasional visitors with a competence that became its own reputation around the county. Men who had come to the ranch expecting to speak to Ira Hadley about business and found Miss Bancroft instead went away having concluded their business, and most of them went away satisfied, even if a few of them went away having expected easier terms and not having received them. Ira was present at the ranch more than she had expected, given his reputation as a man of business who traveled regularly. She concluded after a few weeks that he was present more than usual because something at the ranch was holding his attention. She had a theory about what that something was, but she kept the theory to herself and observed. They fell into the habit of sitting on the porch in the evenings after supper. This began practically because the evenings were the only cool part of the day and the porch faced west and caught the last light. It became habitual in the way that pleasures become habitual, because it was good and because neither of them moved to stop it. They talked on those evenings about everything and nothing. About books, because both of them read, which was something each discovered about the other with mild surprise, and then with the particular pleasure of an unexpected alignment. He had a shelf of books in the main room that included history and some philosophy, and a battered copy of David Copperfield that he admitted to having read twice. She had brought a small collection in her trunk that included a volume of poetry and a practical manual on veterinary care for cattle that she had used so often the spine had cracked. He showed her the poetry book when she placed it on the shelf in the office, and she felt his thumb move across the cover with an attention that was not quite casual. About the territory and its future, and what they each believed about the land and how it should be worked and held. About the question of the small ranchers being pushed out by the larger operations, a thing that was happening all over Texas in the 1870s, the consolidation of land into larger and larger holdings, the men who had homesteaded in good faith finding themselves squeezed by economic forces and legal pressures that had not existed when they started. Helen spoke about this with a feeling that was personal and sharp, because her father's 240 acres was precisely the kind of holding that was most vulnerable. "Your father's land is good land," Ira said one evening. They were sitting in the chairs on the porch, the sun gone but the sky still holding light at the horizon. "It is," Helen said. "He put 20 years of work into it. What do you intend to do with it when the note is clear?" Helen was quiet for a moment. "Work it," she said, "same as he did." Ira turned his head to look at her. The last light caught the side of her face and she was looking at the horizon with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something that mattered. "Alone?" he asked. The word hung in the warm air between them. "I have managed alone before," Helen said. "That is not the same as wanting to," Ira said. She turned to look at him then, and they were at the same latitude in their chairs, the same level, looking at each other across the narrow space between them. The air had the quality it gets in late summer evenings on the Texas plain, soft and slightly suspended, as if the day is holding its breath before it finally lets go. "You are very direct," she said. "I have found it saves time," he replied. The corner of her mouth moved. It was almost a smile. "Yes," she said, "I can see how that would be useful." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't mean to press you," he said. "It's not my business." "Then why ask?" He looked at her. "Because I find that I am interested in what becomes of you," he said, "and I am finding it increasingly difficult to pretend otherwise." Helen sat with this statement for a moment. The honesty of it was almost shocking in its cleanness. She had been around men who circled and angled and came at things sideways for years. This was different. This was a man saying a thing plainly and waiting to see what she did with it. "Mr. Hadley," she said. "Ira," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at him for another moment. "Ira," she said. His name in her mouth had a quality to it that was new, a weight, a rightness. "I find that I am also interested," she said. "I am just being more careful about what I do with that information." He nodded slowly. "That is very sensible," he said. "I try to be," she said. They sat in the last of the light, and neither of them said anything more. But the silence between them had changed, and they both felt it, and neither of them moved to change it back. The first month passed, and on the first day of the second month, Ira handed Helen an envelope with her pay in it, which was $50 as agreed. And he had also, without making a production of it, spoken to Harlan Webb at the bank and had the deadline extended and the note amended. And on the morning that Helen rode into Dusk Creek with her first pay in her hand and cleared the debt on the Bancroft land, She sat outside the bank afterward on the steps for a long time with the receipt in her hands. The land was hers. Her father had worked it for 20 years and had nearly lost it, and she had walked into a saloon in desperation and had come out with a solution that she had not planned, and the land was hers. She thought of her father, of his methodical handwriting in his records, of his silence that was never empty, of his hands on the land he had loved. She let herself cry briefly in the August sun outside the Dust Creek bank, and nobody bothered her, and when she was finished, she wiped her eyes and stood up and rode back to the Hadley ranch because she had work to do. Ira was in the yard when she returned. He saw her face, which was composed but also had the particular clarity of a face that has recently wept and been washed by it. He did not say anything about it. He just said, "Done." And she said, "Done," and he nodded, and that was the full conversation. But later that evening on the porch, he brought 2 cups of coffee rather than just his own, and he handed her one without ceremony, and she took it, and they sat together in the kind of comfortable shared quiet that takes months to build and is worth a great deal when you have it. The nights on the Texas plain in late August were beginning to carry a hint of something cooler in the last hours before dawn, a promise of the fall that was coming. Helen had started wearing a light jacket on the morning rides, and Ira had started building a fire in the stone fireplace in the evenings, even when the temperature was not quite cold enough to require it, which she suspected was more about having a fire in the evening than about warmth. There was an afternoon, a Thursday, when it rained. Not the brief violent downpours that the Texas summer threw at you as if testing your endurance, but a steady gray rain that came in from the north and lasted all day and made the ranch yard a puddle and the horses philosophical. The ranch hands retreated to the bunkhouse. Ira stayed in the house. They spent the afternoon in the main room. Helen was working on the books at the table, and Ira was reading, or making the appearance of reading, a position he occupied in the armchair by the fireplace. After an hour without particular premeditation, he set the book down and said, "Would you like to hear something?" She looked up. "What?" He went to the shelf and took down a box that she had not paid attention to before, and from it he produced a harmonica, which was the instrument of the frontier if ever there was one, carried in pockets and played around fires and in bunkhouses and on lonely night watches since before the territory was properly settled. He sat back in the chair and played something that she did not recognize, a tune that was slow and a little melancholy and very beautiful in the way that simple things played well are beautiful. Helen sat with her pen in her hand and listened. The rain came against the windows. The fire shifted in the hearth. He played the tune through twice and then lowered the harmonica and looked at her. "What is that?" she asked. "Something I learned a long time ago," he said. "An old song, I don't know its name." "My father used to whistle," she said, "in the morning while he worked. The same few tunes over and over. I can still hear them." She paused. "I didn't realize I missed that sound until just now." Ira looked at her with the quiet, particular attention that she had come to recognize as his version of tenderness. He did not say anything. He played the tune again, and she turned back to her books, and the afternoon passed in the best possible way, which is to say with music and rain and warm light, and the simple company of another person who understood the value of not disturbing a good thing. The shift from professional companionship to something more happened not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of many small ones, the way rivers are made. It happened in the evening conversations that ranged farther and got warmer as the weeks progressed. It happened in the way he started anticipating her morning coffee and had it ready before she reached the kitchen. It happened in the way she started noticing, and then watching for, the particular sound of his boot on the porch steps in the evening. It happened in the way they stood closer together when looking at the account books or a map of the property than was strictly required for the task at hand. It happened most clearly on a Sunday morning in September when Helen was in the corral, working with the chestnut mare on some behavioral issues. The horse had developed around being bridled. A patience game that required standing in one place and waiting for the horse to decide to accept the bit on its own terms rather than forcing it. Ira came to lean on the fence and watch, and he watched for a long time, and when the horse finally dipped her head and accepted the bridle with a kind of graceful surrender, Helen looked up from the horse with the satisfaction of a completed task and found Ira looking at her with an expression that was so unguarded, so completely without the careful containment he usually maintained, that she felt it like a physical thing. She led the horse to the fence and looked at him through the rails. "You have a way with that," he said. "You just have to let them come to you," she said. "You can't push a horse into trusting you." He was quiet for a moment. The Sunday morning light was soft and horizontal across the yard. He said, "Helen." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt the word in her sternum as if it had found a home there. "Ira," she said. He looked at her across the fence rails, and his hands were on the top rail, and he was very still, the way he was still when he was thinking carefully. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly if you are willing. If you are not, I will accept that without any change to our arrangement here, and I will not raise the subject again. But I would rather know." Helen looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she knew of him, which was now considerable. She thought about Samuel Torr's 8 years of loyalty and what that said. She thought about a man who had tried to extend a banknote for a dead man's daughter, because the dead man had once pulled him out of a river. She thought about the harmonica on a rainy afternoon and the cup of coffee placed beside her in the morning, and the way he listened to her, really listened, as if what she thought mattered. She thought about the particular quality of her own feelings when she heard his boot on the porch steps. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Something changed in his face, a loosening, a relief that was also a joy, the joy of a man who had been asking himself a question and had finally received an answer he had hardly dared want. He almost smiled, the eyes more than the mouth kind, and then he did actually smile properly, and it transformed his face into something that Helen found she was extremely glad she had the opportunity to see. "Then I will be formal about it," he said. "Will you allow me to take you to supper on Friday in Dusk Creek?" "I will," she said. He nodded once, as if sealing a contract, and she felt a laugh rising in her chest at the way he conducted even his personal life with the straightforward efficiency of a business arrangement. And she let the laugh come, quietly, and he looked at her with the wondering expression of a man who was still getting used to the sound. The Friday supper in Dusk Creek was at the town's best establishment, which was a dining room attached to the hotel called Mabel's, run by a woman named Mabel who had opinions about food and about manners, and who maintained both at an elevated standard. The dining room had linen tablecloths, which was unusual for Dusk Creek, and candles on the tables, and a printed menu that was changed weekly. It was as fine as anything in the county. Helen wore her best dress, which was a deep green with a high collar that she had brought from home and saved for occasions. She had not had an occasion to wear it since the funeral, and putting it on in her room at the ranch that Friday evening, she had paused for a moment with her hands on the fabric and thought of her father, not with grief, but with something more forward-looking, a wish that he could see her, here, in this life that was becoming something she had not anticipated. She wore her hair down, which she did not do on working days. It was dark and heavy and it fell past her shoulders, and when she came out of her room and found Ira waiting in the main room in a clean dark coat, he went still for just a moment and said, very quietly, "You look beautiful." She looked at him and she believed him, and she felt the blood rise slightly in her cheeks, and she said, "You look very well yourself," which was both an observation and a statement of feeling, and he held the door for her and they went to supper. The supper at Mabel's was everything that was promised. The food was excellent by any standard and exceptional by the standards of West Texas in 1878, and the candles were lit, and they sat across from each other at a corner table and talked for 3 hours without pause. Helen had been in conversation with him for weeks, but this was different. There was a declaration in it, a choice, a willingness on both sides to be somewhere specific together, and that willingness gave everything a particular warmth. He told her about his life in a way he had not before, not as a professional history but as a personal one. He had been born in 1844 in Tennessee, the fourth of 5 children. He had come to Texas after the war, which he had served in on the Union side despite the geography of his origins, a fact that had complicated certain relationships over the years, and that he mentioned without apology. He had worked cattle for 3 years before he had enough to buy his first small parcel of land, and he had built from there over the course of a decade through careful work and very few mistakes, and the occasional piece of good fortune. He had been married once briefly in 1870. His wife's name had been Clara, and she had died in 1872 of a fever, and they had not had children. He spoke of this directly and simply, with the matter-of-fact quality of grief that has been lived with long enough to settle into the bones. Helen told him about her life in the way she had not done before, not the practical version, but the more personal one. About growing up with her father after her mother's death, about the particular education she had received from a man who treated her as an intelligent person without ever remarking on it. About the years she had imagined when she was younger, leaving the land, going east, seeing other things. About the moment which had come gradually and then all at once, when she had understood that the land was not something you could leave behind without leaving part of yourself behind too. "It's in my blood," she said simply. "I tried to pretend it wasn't when I was 17. By the time I was 20, I had stopped pretending." "The best things tend to be that way," Ira said. "You can resist them for a while, but they find you anyway." He was looking at her when he said it, and she met his eyes, and the candle between them was very warm, and she said, "Yes," in a voice that was not entirely about the land, and he knew it. And the evening was the best evening either of them had had in a very long time. They rode back to the ranch in the dark, side by side on horseback, the night sky enormous above them in the way it is in the Texas plain where there are no mountains to interrupt it. The Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other like something poured across the dark. They rode without much talking, but it was the talking they did not need to do, the silence of 2 people whose company is its own complete conversation. At the ranch, he helped her down from her horse, which he had done before without any particular weight to it, but this time he held her hand a moment longer than necessary after she was down, and they stood very close in the dark, and the moment was full of everything that had been building between them. "Helen," he said. "Yes," she said before he had finished asking. He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and warm, and she had not heard that from him before either, the full sound of it unguarded. "I was going to ask if I could see you tomorrow," he said. "Oh," she said, and she laughed too. "Well, yes to that also." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, an old-fashioned gesture that was somehow exactly right in this place and time, and she felt it all the way up her arm and into her chest. And he released her hand and stepped back and said good night. And she said good night. And she went inside and stood in her room in the dark for a long time before she remembered she should probably change out of her green dress. The weeks that followed had a new color to them, a warmth over everything that was not just the late Texas summer. They worked together as they had before, but with a new openness between them, a willingness to let their feelings be visible that had not been there before. He reached for her hand in the evenings on the porch, and she let him take it, and they sat that way in the warm dark. She found herself leaning her head against his shoulder on one of those evenings, not planned, just the natural inclination of her body toward his, and he did not move, and she did not correct it, and they stayed that way until the stars moved. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in October, when the first proper cool of the fall had arrived, and the light had changed to that particular golden quality that only exists in autumn in the South. They had been riding back from the north pasture together, and they had stopped at the top of the rise that looked over the full span of the ranch in the afternoon light, and it was so beautiful, the land and the light and the moment, that Helen said so aloud, and he turned to look at her saying it rather than at the view, and she turned and found him already looking, and then he leaned across from his horse and kissed her, which involved a somewhat athletic geometry that made her laugh against his mouth. And he pulled back just enough to look at her laughing, and then kissed her again, more thoroughly, and the horses were patient about the whole thing, which was good. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "since roughly the second week." "Only since the second week," she said. "You were more restrained than I thought." He gave her a look of mock severity that turned into something warmer. "Miss Bancroft," he said, and then corrected himself. "Helen, I want to say something." She waited. "I am 34 years old," he said, "and I have built things in my life that I am satisfied with, but I have also been alone for a long time, in the particular way that you are alone when the thing you are missing is the right person rather than company in general." He was looking at her with that unguarded quality she loved. "I did not expect to find the right person in the circumstances I found you, but here we are, and I want you to know that my intentions toward you are serious, if you are willing to receive them as such." Helen looked at him in the autumn light on the rise of the hill above his land, and she thought that there was very little in the world that was better than a serious man saying a serious thing simply and honestly. "I am," she said, "willing to receive them." He took her hand there on the horseback and held it, and they looked out over the land together. The fall moved in on the Texas plain with the steady purpose of weather that knows where it is going. The cattle drive to the railhead at Abilene was completed in October, a significant undertaking that involved all of the ranch hands and 2 weeks of hard travel, and that Helen managed the logistics for with a thoroughness that left Ira with nothing to criticize and a great deal to admire. She coordinated the supplies, managed the ranch books during the drive, communicated with the buyers in Abilene by telegraph through the Dust Creek office, and had the final accounting complete and balanced within a day of the hand's return. Ira came back from the drive with a good price and a deep tiredness, and with the particular look of a man who has been away from somewhere he wanted to be. He found Helen on the porch with a cup of coffee and his harmonica on the rail beside her, which she had picked up and taught herself the first 3 notes of the old tune while he was gone, and he sat down beside her and took the harmonica from the rail and played the whole tune through, and she told him she had learned the first 3 notes, and he showed her the next 3, and they sat together in the cool October evening with the stars coming out and the cattle settled in the pasture and the ranch quiet around them. "I miss this," he said. "The ranch," she asked. "You," he said, the simple word. She leaned into him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the good dark. In November, there was an unexpected complication with the Bancroft land. A man named Clifford Pierce, who was a land agent from San Antonio representing a larger ranch operation, appeared in Dust Creek with a legal paper that he claimed gave him right-of-way across the north corner of the Bancroft property, which would have effectively devalued the land by cutting off access to the best water source on the property. He was a smooth, confident man in a good suit, who had the practiced manner of someone who had done this to smaller landowners before, and expected to do it again. He came to the Hadley ranch on a Tuesday morning because he had been told that Miss Bancroft was managing from there. He explained his position with a great deal of legal-sounding language that was designed to be confusing. Helen listened to all of it, asked him to show her the paper, and read it carefully and in full. "This right-of-way dates to 1871, she said, when she had finished reading. "My father was in possession of that land in 1871, and he did not sign this document." Pierce smiled the smile of a man who has an answer prepared. "The previous deed holder, a Mr. Augustus Webb, signed the agreement before your father's purchase." "Mr. Webb sold the land to my father in 1868, Helen said. "This document dates to 1871. If Mr. Webb signed this in 1871, he did not have the right to do so. He did not own the land at that time." There was a small silence. Ira, who had come in from outside during this conversation and was standing in the doorway of the office, watched Pierce's smooth face recalculate. "I would need to review the deed history," Pierce said. "Yes, you would," Helen said. "I have the original deed of sale from Webb to Bancroft dated August of 1868, and I am happy to send a copy to whatever legal representation you have in the territory. But I want to be clear, Mr. Pierce, that this paper is not valid and I will not be moved by it." Pierce looked at her and then looked at Ira in the doorway and then looked back at Helen. He left without concluding any business and he did not return. Afterward, Ira said to her, "You were certain about the dates." "My father kept every piece of paper he ever received," Helen said. "I have the entire file in a box at the boarding house. I knew the moment he gave me the date of that document." Ira looked at her with an expression of uncomplicated admiration. "Your father's daughter," he said. "I try to be," she said. November brought with it the full weight of autumn, and with it the particular quality of the ranch in the colder months, the smell of wood smoke and hay in cold mornings, the way the light came low and horizontal across the land. Helen had been at the Hadley ranch for almost 4 months now, and she had been courted properly and with great seriousness by its owner for nearly 2 of them. And on the first Sunday of November, when the sky was clear and cold and blue above the ranch, Ira Hadley asked her to marry him. He did it in the way that was entirely characteristic of him. They were in the office after Sunday breakfast, looking at plans for a new water trough system for the spring, and he put down the pen he was holding and turned to face her and said, "Helen, will you marry me?" She looked up from the plans. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded quality she had come to love, his feelings entirely visible, and in them she could see not just the question but everything behind it, the seriousness with which he had arrived at it, the care in it, the particular hope of a man who has been careful for a long time and is now being brave. She thought about her father. She thought about a gun she had almost sold and hadn't. She thought about walking into a saloon in desperation and walking out with a beginning she had not seen coming. She thought about what she felt every morning when she heard him in the kitchen and every evening on the porch and every hour in between. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He stood from his chair and she stood from hers, and he took her face in both his hands very gently and kissed her, and then held her, and she held him, and the Sunday light came through the office window and lay warm across them both. They were married in December of 1878, in the small church in Dust Creek, on a cold, clear Saturday with the sky the hard winter blue that West Texas does better than almost anywhere. The congregation was modest, the ranch hands and Samuel Torres and his wife, a few people from town including Mabel of Mabel's dining room who cried at every wedding she attended as a matter of principle. Helen wore her green dress, the best one, the one she had worn on their first supper, and her hair was down, and she carried a small arrangement of dried flowers that were the best that could be had in December in that part of Texas. She had her father's gun in its oilskin cloth in the room back at the ranch, on the writing desk where it lived now, cleaned and whole, not sold, not lost. She had thought about him that morning while she dressed, and she had told him things in the quiet of the room, the kind of things you tell the dead when you want them to know you are all right. Ira was waiting for her at the front of the church with the composure that was natural to him, and a quality behind it that was not composure at all. That was joy kept carefully in check by the last remaining shreds of his formal manner. And when she walked up the aisle to him and took his hand, the formal manner gave way entirely, and he looked at her with all of it undisguised, and she looked back at him. And the small church in Dust Creek held that moment the way a bowl holds water, carefully, completely. They said their vows simply and clearly, in the direct manner of 2 people who understood the weight of words. When the minister pronounced them married and Ira kissed her in front of the small congregation, Samuel Torres put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, which he had never done in a church before, and this was apparently contagious because Eli immediately did the same, and Mabel was already crying. And for a moment the small church in Dusk Creek was alive with something that could only be called joy. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was one of the better winters in the memory of that part of Texas. Cold but not brutal, dry enough to manage, with enough rain in the right places to keep the land from suffering. The ranch ran well. The books were balanced and then some. Helen continued to manage the accounts and the suppliers, and Ira made the business trips to Abilene and San Antonio that were part of his trade. And when he came back, he always came back to her, and she was always there. They expanded the house in the spring, adding a room to the east side, and Helen spent some part of every day in those months with mud on her boots from the building site, because she wanted to know what was being built and how, and because she had opinions about windows. The new room had 2 windows, which was her doing, and they let in the morning light in a way that made the whole east end of the house feel different, alive in the morning hours with golden light and the sound of birds. The Bancroft land, 240 acres clear of debt and clear of the legal challenge from the San Antonio agent, was worked that spring by a man Helen hired on Samuel Torr's recommendation, an experienced hand named Marcus Webb, who bore no relation to the bank's Harlan Webb, and who ran the Bancroft property with care under Helen's oversight. She rode there twice a week and made sure things were done as her father would have done them. The methodical records he had kept became her own, continued in the same ledger format, the same careful attention to rainfall and cattle numbers and repairs that he had practiced for 20 years. She was not losing the land. She was keeping it, growing it, making something of it that her father had started and she would continue. The thought gave her a deep, settled satisfaction on the mornings she rode the Bancroft land, and sometimes she would stop her horse on the rise where you could see most of both properties and look out over all of it and feel the completeness of it. In the late summer of 1879, Helen discovered that she was expecting their first child. She told Ira on a warm August evening on the porch, directly, in the manner they had always used with each other. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment, the way he went still when something landed on him that was larger than ordinary things. Then he turned to her and she saw his face, and it was as unguarded as she had ever seen it, more even than the morning she had agreed to marry him, more open, a kind of wonder that was also a kind of breaking open, a man who had not let himself want this thing finding that he had it. He reached for her hand and held it in both of his and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, against his heart which was beating with a force she could feel. "Helen," he said, "I do not have words for this." "I know," she said. "I didn't either." They sat on the porch in the warm August night for a long time, his arm around her, her head against his shoulder, the ranch quiet and full around them. The pregnancy progressed through the fall of 1879, with the good health that comes from a woman who has always been physically strong, and who continues to work with reasonable care and rest. The ranch hands treated her with a kind of reverent awkwardness that was very endearing. Samuel Torrs, who had 2 children of his own in Dusk Creek, provided advice that was occasionally practical and always kindly meant. Young Eli, who had grown over the year into a more settled and capable hand, took it upon himself to ensure that any task requiring significant lifting was never within reach of Mrs. Hadley. He was still adjusting to the change, before she could attempt it herself. Ira was careful with her in the way that was careful without being limiting. He trusted her to know her own body and her own limits. He rode with her when she wanted to ride, walked the land with her in the evenings when walking suited her better, sat with her in the quiet hours and talked or read or played the harmonica softly while the fire burned and the Texas winter closed around the house. The baby was born in April of 1880, on a morning that came in blue and warm with the first real spring warmth of the year. They had a doctor from Dusk Creek, an older man named Dr. Calloway, who had delivered half the county and who had a calm and practiced manner that made difficult things feel manageable. Samuel Torr's wife, Rosa, was also there, a woman of great practical competence who had seen births before and who moved through the house with quiet efficiency. The baby was a boy. He was born in the morning with the spring light coming through the east windows that Helen had insisted on, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's particular stubbornness of expression. And when Ira held him for the first time, with the careful, slightly overwhelmed hands of a man holding something more precious than anything he has ever held, he looked at Helen over the baby's head with an expression that she would keep in her heart for the rest of her life. "James," Helen said, when they were talking about the name. She said it simply, and he understood. "James Hadley," Ira said. "Yes." James Bancroft had pulled a young man from a river in the winter of 1866, and that young man had grown into the person holding this child, and the world was a long story with threads in it that connected forward and backward in ways you could not always see until you were standing in the right place looking at the right moment. They sent a letter to the Dust Creek paper for the birth announcement, a brief formal notice that was the custom of the time. Within a week, a dozen people from town and the surrounding ranches had found occasion to ride by and offer congratulations, including Mabel, who brought food, and the farrier whose contract Helen had renegotiated, who brought a very small pair of boots he had made himself, which was unexpected and touching. James Hadley was an excellent baby, as babies were assessed in those days and in those circumstances, which meant he slept at reasonable intervals and had a good appetite, and did not object to being handed around between the various people who wanted to hold him. Samuel Torrs held him with the ease of a man practiced at this, and said he had the look of a cattle man. Eli held him with the careful terror of someone who had never held a baby and was afraid of doing it wrong, which Helen coached him through with the patience she brought to everything. The spring and summer of 1880 were full and good. The ranch ran well. The Bancroft land ran well. Young James thrived in the way that healthy children thrive, growing with an appetite that surprised them both, and developing opinions about his situation that were expressed with considerable volume. He was, Helen said, very much his father's son in the directness with which he communicated, and Ira took this as the compliment he believed she intended. The relationship between Helen and Ira had, by this point, the depth that comes from a year and a half of marriage and all that that entails, the small daily life of two people who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other in the 10,000 small ways that marriage is made of. The morning coffee that he still made, and she still arrived to find waiting. The evening porch, still their evening porch, now sometimes with a baby in arms, and sometimes in the evenings when Rosa came to sit with James, just the two of them in the quiet dark. The books that they both still read and occasionally read to each other. The harmonica, and the tune she had learned the first 8 notes of, which made him smile every time. They argued occasionally, which was its own kind of health. Helen had strong opinions, and Ira had strong opinions, and sometimes the opinions were not the same, and the arguments were direct and honest and usually resolved in a way that was either one of them being persuaded or a third position being discovered that neither of them had started with. They never argued with cruelty. They never argued with contempt. They argued the way people argue when they respect each other and also need to be right about this particular thing, and when it was over, and they moved forward. There was one argument, in the fall of 1880, that stayed with Helen afterward as an example of why she had chosen him. It was about the Bancroft land, and a proposal from a neighboring rancher to lease a portion of it that would have been profitable but would have required agreeing to certain terms Helen objected to regarding how the leased portion would be used. Ira believed the money was worth the compromise. Helen did not. They went back and forth on it for 2 evenings, both of them making their full case, and on the 3rd evening Ira said, "It's your land, Helen. It has always been your land and the decision belongs to you." She looked at him. You genuinely believe that? I do. Even though we are married and the law doesn't require you to. The law's opinion on this subject is wrong, he said simply, and has been for a long time. She had declined the lease on her own terms, and the neighboring rancher had eventually accepted a more limited arrangement that she was satisfied with, and Ira had said nothing more about it except that he thought she had negotiated it well. In the spring of 1882, their second child arrived. A daughter this time, born in April again, as if April were the season designated for this family's arrivals. They named her Clara, which was Ira's suggestion, and which Helen received with understanding and warmth, because it was right and it was generous, and it was the kind of thing that told her again who this man was. Clara Hadley was dark-eyed and extremely alert from the first hours of her life, regarding the world with a suspicion that made Dr. Calloway laugh. She had her mother's coloring and her father's stillness, and she grew into both. James, who was 2 when she was born, tolerated her presence with the patience of a small person who has been well prepared for a sibling by parents who understood that preparation matters. The ranch, the family, the land, all of it continued to grow and develop in the way that good things grow when they are tended properly. Helen found that motherhood and land management coexisted with less friction than many people predicted, partly because she was efficient and partly because she had help and was willing to accept it, and partly because Ira was a father who was present and involved in a way that was not common and that Helen valued enormously. He was teaching James, by the time the boy was 3, the same things that Helen had been taught: to pay attention to the land, to watch the animals, to understand what they were telling you. He carried the boy on the saddle in front of him on the morning rides, and Helen could see them out there from the kitchen window, the tall, dark figure and the small one, moving through the morning light, and she felt in those moments that the world was arranged correctly. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1883, when James was 3 years old and Clara was 1, and the ranch was running well, and the Bancroft land was a going concern, and the books were balanced, and the water trough system installed 4 springs previous was working exactly as designed, Helen took her father's gun from the writing desk where it had lived for 5 years. She carried it out to the porch where Ira was sitting in the morning light with his coffee, and the sound of his children playing in the yard where Samuel Torr's eldest boy was looking after them. She sat down beside him and unwrapped the oilskin cloth for the first time in a long time. The gun was as clean and well-maintained as it had always been. She had cleaned it every few months, out of a habit of care that her father had instilled. Ira looked at it. "I want to teach James to respect this," Helen said. "Not yet. When he is older, I want him to know what it is and where it came from." "That's right," Ira said. "I want him to know about my father," she said. "All of it. The land and the records and the way he worked and the things he believed." She paused. "And I want him to know that his grandfather saved your life." Ira was quiet for a moment, looking at the gun. Then he looked at her. "He will know," he said. "I'll tell him myself." "I know you will," she said. She wrapped the gun back in the oilskin cloth, carefully, lovingly, in the way you handle the things that carry the weight of who you came from. She set it on the rail of the porch between them, not to be sold, not to be given away, just to rest in the morning light for a moment. "I walked into that saloon to sell this gun," she said. "I was terrified and I was not going to show it." "I know," Ira said. "You were extraordinary." "I was desperate," she said, with the dry quality he loved. "You were both," he said, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the morning was warm and the children were playing in the yard and the land stretched out before them in the full golden light of the Texas fall, and everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that had needed to find its proper place had found it. The Hadley ranch was not only his anymore and not only hers. It was theirs, the way the morning was theirs, and the porch, and the evenings, and the harmonica, and the old tune that she could now play from beginning to end. She had learned it over 5 years, a few notes at a time, and it turned out the song had a name after all. An old folk melody that had no official title in any book either of them owned, but that was called, by the people who played it and passed it on, by the name of its feeling rather than any formal designation. Ira had finally told her this on the night of their second anniversary, when she had played it all the way through for the first time without a single mistake, and he had listened with his eyes closed, and when she finished, he had opened his eyes and looked at her in the firelight and said, "People call it a homecoming song." She had looked at him and said, "Yes," and it was the right word for everything. Years settled around them like good weather, and the life they had built together held against every wind that came, because it had been built by two people who understood the land and understood each other, who had chosen each other with full knowledge and full honesty, and who found, every morning in the kitchen and every evening on the porch, that the choice was still the right one. James Hadley grew to be a serious, capable boy who loved horses and numbers and asked questions until he had understood the answer completely, which everyone recognized as his mother's quality, and who was steady and unhurried in his manner, which everyone recognized as his father's. Clara grew to be a girl of extraordinary curiosity and a sharp, quick wit that could disarm anyone, and who had her mother's directness and her father's depth, and who demonstrated from a very young age that she would make her own decisions about everything in her own time. Helen kept the books and the land and the records in the methodical way her father had taught her, and she added to the tradition a letter written in the spring of each year that described what had happened on the land in the past 12 months, a document addressed to no one in particular but kept in the file with her father's records, so that if someone came along someday looking for the history of the place, they would find it completely accounted for. Ira kept the harmonica and the habit of honesty, and the way of looking at the world that had brought him from a cold river in 1866 to a warm porch in 1883 and beyond, and he gave both of his children the thing that had been given to him without being called a gift, which was the simple understanding that who you were mattered more than almost anything else, and that land was something you held in trust for the people who came after you. The gun lived on the writing desk in its oilskin cloth, and in time James knew its story, and in time after that Clara knew it too, and they both understood that it was not a weapon so much as it was a record, the way all things that are held carefully and not sold become records, of a man who had worked the land honestly, and a daughter who had carried his legacy into a place she had not expected, and a life that had begun in an unplanned conversation in a saloon, and had grown into something as wide and permanent as the Texas sky. When Helen was an old woman and her children were grown and her grandchildren were beginning to appear in the manner of grandchildren, arriving with all the optimism of people who do not yet know what they are in for, she would sometimes take the gun out of its cloth and hold it in her hands, and tell the story of the afternoon she walked into the Silver Spur Saloon in Dusk Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1878. With her father 3 weeks dead and $40 needed, and a piece of land on the line. She would tell about the man at the end of the bar who went quiet when he saw the gun, and about the offer she had not expected, and about the way everything that mattered had come out of that one afternoon, the work and the land and the marriage and the children and the life. And she would say, every time, that the best things often come in through the back door, the ones you are not expecting and would not have planned for and cannot imagine until you are standing in the middle of them. And then she would wrap the gun back in its oilskin cloth, carefully, and put it back on the desk, and she would sit on the porch in the evening light and listen for the sound of boots on the steps that she had been listening for since the fall of 1878. And Ira Hadley, older now and silver at the temples going to fully silver and a little slower on the steps but still himself, entirely and completely himself, would sit down beside her, and she would lean into him. And the land would be there around them in all its magnificent, demanding, beautiful permanence, and there was nothing left unfinished and nothing left undone, and the evening would be exactly what the evening always was, which was enough and then more than enough, which is the only true way of describing a life fully and gratefully lived.